When Chief Executive Genevieve Whitmore fired Micah Rowe, the single father who had quietly held every major client together for over a decade, she believed 33 executives could replace him with a single vote. But by the next morning, contracts worth billions had been suspended one by one. No client wanted to speak with the new committee. Every single one of them asked for Micah by name. By the time the emergency meeting began, Genevieve finally understood the truth. She had chosen 33 titles over one man who carried something money could never buy. Trust that had been earned, one crisis at a time, for 10 straight years. If stories about quiet strength and earned trust move you, follow this channel so you never miss what happens when loyalty finally gets tested. The morning it all began looked like any other morning at Whitmore Crown Solutions, a crisis management firm perched on the upper floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. Sunlight cut across the boardroom where executives adjusted their ties and rehearsed lines for the company's annual client showcase. On the top floor, Genevieve Whitmore stood before a mirror, reviewing her notes for the launch of Crown One, a new platform promised to automate every crisis plan the company had ever built for its clients. She was 40 years old, sharp-eyed, and utterly convinced that the future of the firm depended on proving it no longer needed people the way it once had. 2 floors below her, in a windowless room stacked with binders and old coffee cups, Micah Rowe was already working, calm as ever, guiding a warehouse manager through a power outage that threatened to shut down an entire medical supply chain. Micah did not raise his voice or issue commands. He simply reminded the young manager, gently and precisely, about the backup facility 2 towns over, the substitute driver who had covered that same route before, and the local vendor whose reliability had been verified nearly 2 years earlier. His voice carried the flat, unhurried patience of a man who had talked 100 people through 100 small disasters, the kind of calm that could not be taught in any training seminar, because it had been built slowly, through years of trial, error, and quiet repetition. Within less than an hour, the crisis was contained without a single shipment lost. Preston Wexler, the client on the other end of that call, thanked Micah personally and told him, not for the first time, that his company kept renewing its contract because of him and no one else. Micah brushed the compliment aside and credited the local operations team instead, the way he always did, because attention was never something he had chased. He had started at the company years earlier as an ordinary phone coordinator, answering after-hours calls from panicked warehouse managers, and he had taught himself, night after night, to understand not just contracts but the living rhythm of every business he served. He remembered the names of forklift operators and the birthdays of dock supervisors, the specific stretch of highway that flooded every spring near one client's distribution hub, and the reason a certain hotel chain never wanted deliveries scheduled before 7 in the morning. None of that knowledge lived in a spreadsheet, and none of it had ever been written into any formal job description, yet it was precisely the reason clients called him first when anything went wrong. Genevieve, reviewing the account reports later that morning, noticed something she had noticed many times before, but never fully confronted. Micah's name appeared, in one form or another, in nearly every strategic account the company held. Everett Langston had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the ranks of Whitmore Crown Solutions, and everyone who worked closely with him understood, without it ever being said aloud, that he intended to sit in Genevieve's chair one day. He dressed the part carefully, always a half-step ahead of the current fashion in tailored suits, and he had a talent for translating complicated ideas into confident, quotable sentences that boardrooms loved to hear. Crown One had been his idea from the very beginning, born less out of genuine belief in automation than out of a sharp understanding that whoever delivered the future to Genevieve would be rewarded for it handsomely. Everett Langston, the company's ambitious chief operating officer saw the same pattern and framed it as a warning rather than an asset. He told Genevieve, in the clipped and confident tone he used for every pitch, that clients did not trust the company itself. They trusted a single employee, and that was a liability no modern firm could afford. If Micah ever left, he argued, the entire business could collapse overnight, and that fragility alone justified building something that did not depend on any one person's memory or goodwill. Micah was summoned upstairs to give his opinion on Crown One before the showcase began. He did not object to the technology itself, only to the way it had been built, and he warned the room that data could describe what had happened before, but could never explain why a client had made a particular choice in the first place. Micah spoke slowly, choosing his words with the same care he used when explaining a crisis to a frightened client, because he understood that in a room full of people eager to prove him obsolete, tone mattered as much as substance. He pointed out that Crown One had already stripped away dozens of contextual notes the system considered unstructured and therefore unnecessary. One of those notes concerned Wexler Medical Distribution specifically, a standing instruction that a certain shipping vendor should never again be used because of a documented history of broken commitments. Everett waved the concern away, insisting such details could simply be re-entered later if they ever became relevant again. Micah answered quietly that a crisis never waited politely for someone to update a database after the system had already made the wrong call. The tension in the room thickened, though most of the executives said nothing, unwilling to challenge Everett in front of the woman who now controlled their careers. Micah glanced around the polished table, at the tailored suits and the expensive watches, and felt the familiar weight of being the only person in the room who had never sat in a business school lecture hall. He did not resent it. He simply understood, in that quiet moment, that his value had never come from credentials framed on a wall, but from the thousand small promises he had kept when no one else was watching. Before the meeting ended, Everett placed a single document on the table in front of Genevieve, a formal request signed by 33 executives asking that Micah be stripped of authority over every strategic account the company held. The emergency session that followed took place inside the firm's glass-walled boardroom, where all 33 signers gathered beneath the hum of recessed lighting. They represented technology, finance, legal affairs, operations, and every regional division the company maintained, and together they formed a wall of credentials that Micah, in his well-worn suit, could never hope to match. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and printer toner, and the low hum of the air conditioning was the only sound for a moment before Everett rose to speak, smoothing his jacket with the practiced confidence of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment many times in his head. Everett opened by painting Micah as an obstacle to modernization, a man clinging to an outdated model built entirely around himself. He presented figures meant to look damning on the surface. That Micah spent more hours with clients than policy required, that he sometimes waived consulting fees when the company itself had made a mistake, that he rarely upsold additional services the way other account executives routinely did, and that an overwhelming number of clients insisted on speaking with him directly rather than anyone else on staff. Everett called this pattern a hero model, one that made the company impossible to scale, and conveniently left out the fact that the accounts under Micah's care renewed at a rate no other division came close to matching. Delaney Cross, the company's careful and sharp-minded general counsel, raised a quiet objection, warning that many of the client contracts contained clauses allowing early termination if service quality or data control changed significantly. Everett dismissed her concern by insisting that Crown One already contained the entirety of Micah's institutional knowledge, reducing him to a redundancy rather than a necessity. Genevieve turned to Micah directly, and asked whether he was prepared to formally transfer his accounts to the newly formed executive committee. He agreed to hand over every operational function required, but he asked that the activation of Crown One be delayed until each client had personally verified the accuracy of their own account data. Everett accused him of stalling deliberately, of trying to preserve his own value by keeping the transition incomplete, and the accusation landed harder in the room than anything Micah had actually said. From a screen mounted on the far wall, August Whitmore, chairman of the board and Genevieve's uncle, reminded her firmly that no chief executive could allow a single employee to overrule the collective judgment of her own leadership team. Genevieve looked at the 33 signatures in front of her, each one belonging to someone with advanced degrees, decades of polished experience, and a title that photographed well on a company website. Across from them sat only Micah, without allies powerful enough to challenge that wall of credentials, without a title that carried any real weight in a room built to respect exactly that kind of weight. She chose the 33. Micah's access to every strategic account was revoked before the meeting even adjourned, and Genevieve announced that Crown One would go live at midnight, regardless of what verification remained unfinished. Micah warned, one final time, that the system was folding together clients with entirely different needs into identical priority tiers, a decision that would eventually collide with reality in ways no algorithm could predict. No one in that room chose to listen. Genevieve told him plainly that all 33 executives believed the company would be stronger without depending on him, and Micah answered, without raising his voice, that she had simply asked the people who wanted his job whether they were capable of taking it. There was no argument left to have after that, and Genevieve instructed Human Resources to prepare his termination paperwork before the day was finished. The timing could not have been worse, because that same afternoon marked the company's annual client reception, an event Everett deliberately chose as the moment to signal, publicly and unmistakably, that the era of Micah Rowe had ended. Genevieve stood before the gathered clients and announced that Micah no longer represented Whitmore Crown Solutions in any capacity. In his place, she introduced the 33 executives as a newly formed client council meant to offer what she called comprehensive representation for every account the firm managed. Several longtime clients exchanged uneasy glances, surprised that a change of this magnitude had never been discussed with them beforehand. Marlo Bennett, the exacting and formidable chairwoman of Bennett Grand Hotels, asked plainly who would now be personally responsible for her account. Everett answered that Crown One would automatically route any issue to whichever executive was best suited to handle it. A response that sounded impressive until Marlo asked who would take final responsibility when 33 different executives inevitably gave 33 different answers to the same question. Everett deflected with vague language about the strength of collective expertise, but the deflection did little to settle the unease spreading quietly through the room. Micah was asked to surrender his building access card in full view of the very clients he had protected for years, and he did so without protest, without pleading, and without a single word about everything he had given the company over the past decade. Before leaving the building, he handed Delaney a modest box of files containing unfinished data verifications, a list of processes he believed should never be fully automated, and a summary of contractual clauses meant to protect each client's ownership of their own information. Everett mocked the gesture openly, remarking that Crown One had no use for an old man's paper folders in an age of intelligent systems. Micah turned to Genevieve one final time and reminded her that clients did not sign contracts because of a logo etched into glass on the side of a downtown tower. They signed because they believed that when everything eventually went wrong, someone specific would answer the phone and take responsibility for making it right. Genevieve accused him of threatening to poach her clients on his way out the door, and Micah answered simply that he intended to contact no one at all, because people who had already lost their trust rarely needed to be persuaded to leave. They simply left on their own. He drove home that evening through streets slick with the season's first hard rain, the wipers ticking a steady rhythm against the windshield as the downtown lights blurred and scattered behind him. He returned to the modest house he shared with his 15-year-old daughter, Lena, the only family he had left since losing his wife to illness 6 years earlier. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the dinner Lena had attempted on her own, something simple and slightly overcooked, and for a moment Micah simply stood in the doorway and let the ordinary warmth of the house settle over him like something he had almost forgotten to appreciate. Lena noticed her father arriving home far earlier than usual and asked, with the quiet directness only a teenager can manage, whether he regretted standing his ground against the people who had just pushed him out. Micah told her honestly that his only regret was not finding a way to make them listen before the consequences arrived instead of after. He sat down across from her at the small kitchen table, the same table where he had once helped her with fractions and, later, with the harder arithmetic of grief after her mother passed. Lena studied him for a long moment, the way she often did when she suspected he was hiding how tired he truly felt, and she told him plainly that she had never once seen him lie to a stranger just to make his own life easier, and she did not expect tonight to be any different. That single sentence, spoken so simply by a 15-year-old, settled something in him that 33 signatures never could. That night, he placed his phone in a drawer and made a private decision not to contact a single client, no matter what happened next, because he refused to give anyone the chance to accuse him of stealing business out of spite. At exactly midnight, Everett gave the order to activate Crown One across all 18 of the company's strategic accounts, confident that the system built to replace one man would prove, by morning, that it never needed him at all. An unexpected ice storm swept through the Midwest that very night, disrupting transportation routes across several states and triggering a flood of automated alerts inside Crown One within minutes. The system began reallocating resources instantly, weighing every decision purely by cost and geographic distance, and on the surface, each choice appeared perfectly logical. What the system could not know, however, was that one of Wexler's warehouses was mid-renovation and physically unable to accept new shipments that week. It could not know that a cheaper route required heavy trucks to travel roads that banned overnight commercial traffic, or that Bennett Grand Hotels had permanently blacklisted a certain vendor years earlier after a serious data leak, or that Shaw Industrial needed a small but essential component prioritized above shipments of far greater dollar value. Across the Midwest, ice-coated power lines and highway overpasses in a thin, treacherous glaze, and inside the operations center at Whitmore Crown, screens glowed red with cascading alerts that no single person could interpret fast enough. Crown One began routing critical resources to entirely the wrong locations, technically correct and practically disastrous at the very same time. All 33 executives scrambled to respond, yet none of them held the full picture required to make a single confident decision. Each handled only a narrow slice of the crisis, forwarding client calls from one department to another in an endless, dizzying relay. Preston Wexler demanded to speak with whoever held final decision-making authority, and instead found himself transferred through 6 different executives within less than an hour. Marlo Bennett received 3 separate emails offering 3 contradictory sets of instructions before the sun had even risen. Colton Shaw, the blunt and fiercely fair founder of Shaw Industrial Systems, discovered that an essential component his factory needed had been ranked below shipments that were expensive but far less urgent. Everett explicitly forbade anyone on staff from reaching out to Micah, insisting that doing so would amount to a public confession that firing him had been a mistake. Harrison had built his career believing that any problem, given enough clean data and enough processing power, could eventually be solved without needing to rely on the unpredictable judgment of any single human being. He had poured months into Crown One, proud of its clean architecture and its confident, instant recommendations, and watching it fail in real time felt less like a technical malfunction and more like watching a carefully built house shift on a foundation he had never properly tested. Harrison Vale, the company's technology chief and Crown One's primary architect, slowly began to realize the platform was not malfunctioning at all in any technical sense. It was executing flawlessly according to data that had already been stripped of the very context that once made it meaningful. What the crisis truly required was someone who understood not just the numbers on a screen, but the reasons behind every exception buried beneath them. And those reasons had lived, almost entirely, inside Micah's discarded files. Delaney finally opened the box he had left behind and found every one of that night's failures already predicted in careful, unhurried handwriting. Genevieve began to understand, slowly and painfully, that Micah had never opposed Crown One to protect his own position. He had opposed it to protect clients from a system that was clearly not yet ready to protect them itself. At 2:07 in the morning, Preston Wexler finally gave up on the executive committee entirely and dialed Micah's personal number instead. In the dim quiet of his living room, Micah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pressing against his eyes, some old instinct telling him that the night was not yet finished. He saw the name appear on his screen and hesitated before answering, keenly aware that his access to the company's systems had already been fully revoked, and equally aware of how easily this moment could be twisted into something it was not. Preston left a message clarifying that this was not a request coming from the company at all, but a personal plea from a client whose entire supply chain was slipping out of control. Micah eventually picked up, but only after setting clear boundaries for himself, his voice low so as not to wake Lena down the hall. "I can't touch anything that belongs to Whitmore Crown," Micah told him plainly. "But if you've got your own plan in front of you, I can help you read it." He would not use any internal Whitmore Crown data, he would not speak on behalf of the company in any capacity, and he could only help Preston read through a plan that Preston himself already legally owned. Together, they opened the contingency plan Micah had built years earlier, specifically for Wexler Medical Distribution. Micah guided him toward an appendix describing an alternate route and a local backup facility that Crown One had overlooked entirely because the algorithm judged it more expensive on paper than the primary option. The solution had been sitting inside the client's own documents the entire time, plainly visible, simply waiting for someone who understood why it mattered. Preston thanked him twice before hanging up, his voice thick with relief, and Micah reminded him gently that the credit belonged to Preston's own team for having the plan ready and organized in the first place. Within the hour, Wexler's supply chain was stable again, and not long after, Marlo Bennett called as well. Her voice was crisp even at that hour, carrying none of the panic Preston had shown, only a cold, precise anger that Micah had come to recognize as her particular way of demanding accountability. She did not ask Micah what she should do. She asked, sharply, why the new system had reinstated a vendor her company had banned years earlier for compromising guest data. Micah pointed her toward the exact clause buried in her own contract, and Marlo immediately suspended every instruction Crown One had issued that night. Colton Shaw became the third client to call, and Micah handled his situation with the same careful restraint, relying only on documents that Colton already owned outright. He never once criticized Genevieve, never once encouraged any client to abandon the company, and that quiet restraint only deepened the trust each of them placed in him. Word spread quickly among the leadership of all 18 strategic accounts as the night wore on. Each client slowly discovered that Micah had, over the years, given them complete copies of their own contingency plans, even while the company itself had always preferred that such information remain locked exclusively inside its own internal systems. Micah had protected their independence even when doing so made it easier for them to eventually walk away from Whitmore Crown altogether. By 4 in the morning, 12 of the 18 clients had already called him directly, and the remaining 6 sent formal requests asking him to serve as an independent advisor during the crisis. Micah told them honestly that he had no company of his own yet, no staff, and no insurance structure capable of accepting that kind of responsibility. Preston suggested that the clients themselves could pool resources to fund some kind of temporary independent unit until the immediate danger passed. Micah declined any payment while the crisis remained unresolved and asked only that everyone focus first on stabilizing their operations. Lena woke sometime before dawn and found her father sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by 18 open contingency plans spread across the carpet like pieces of a puzzle only he could see clearly. She said nothing, simply placing a cup of coffee beside him before returning quietly to her room, understanding without being told that this was not a moment that needed her words. Before 6 in the morning, all 18 clients sent Genevieve the exact same notice, suspending Whitmore Crown's operational authority and naming Micah as their emergency point of contact instead. Genevieve walked into the operations center that morning and found 18 identical notifications waiting for her, each one carrying the same unmistakable message. None of the clients demanded immediate compensation or threatened legal retaliation outright. They simply stated, without hesitation, that they no longer trusted the Committee of 33 to represent their interests in any meaningful way. Everett immediately accused Micah of secretly courting the clients behind the company's back, but Delaney checked every communication log and confirmed that Micah had never placed a single outbound call to any of them. Every one of those calls had originated entirely from the clients themselves, and Micah had never once accessed Whitmore Crown's internal systems after his termination, relying strictly on documents that already legally belonged to each client. Genevieve called Micah directly and asked him to return to the company immediately. He refused to come back as an ordinary employee while the same flawed structure that had failed overnight remained fully intact. She told him bluntly that thousands of jobs now depended on whatever decision he made next. Micah agreed to help stabilize operations for 24 hours without payment, but only under 3 specific conditions. Every client would retain full ownership and control of their own data going forward. No junior staff member would be blamed for decisions made by leadership above them, and Crown One would stop making fully automated decisions until every client had personally verified the accuracy of their own information. Everett objected fiercely to the 3rd condition, arguing that accepting it amounted to a public admission that the entire project had failed outright. But Genevieve overruled him and accepted every term Micah proposed. Micah walked the length of the operations floor that morning, past desks still cluttered with the previous night's chaos, half-finished coffee going cold beside abandoned notepads. He did not raise his voice to command attention. He simply began speaking, calmly, and one by one the exhausted executives stopped what they were doing to listen. Micah restructured the 33 executives into 18 dedicated teams, one for each strategic client, rather than dividing responsibility by department, the way the company always had before. Each team was instructed to listen directly to the people actually running daily operations for their client, instead of relying solely on dashboards filled with numbers stripped of context. Micah did not attempt to solve every problem personally. Instead, he helped each executive understand the living connection between raw data, institutional history, and the promises the company had made over the years. Harrison worked quickly to restore the contextual notes that had been deleted from Crown One, and almost immediately the system began producing far more accurate recommendations. By 8 that morning, operations across all 18 accounts had finally stabilized. Genevieve allowed herself to hope that surviving the crisis alone might be enough to win those clients back. But Delaney soon informed her that every single one had already invoked their formal right to review their contracts, and every one of them had requested a single in-person meeting before the day was over, with Micah as the only person all 18 would agree to have moderate the conversation. By early afternoon, the storm outside had finally broken, leaving the city washed pale and glittering under a thin winter sun, though nothing about the mood inside the tower felt equally clear. Representatives from all 18 clients arrived at Whitmore Crown's headquarters that afternoon, filling the largest conference room the company owned. Genevieve sat at the head of the table beside her 33 executives, while Micah entered wearing nothing more than a temporary visitor's badge, no formal title attached to his name at all. Everett opened by framing the entire disaster as nothing more than an ordinary technical hiccup during a routine transition. Preston Wexler asked directly who had made the decision to strip backup routes out of the system in the first place, and 3 different executives offered 3 completely different answers. Marlowe asked who bore final responsibility for reinstating a vendor her company had explicitly banned, and no one in the room could answer because the decision had emerged from too many overlapping departments for any single person to own it. Colton Shaw asked which of the 33 executives understood why his factory prioritized one small, inexpensive component over a shipment worth millions of dollars. Not a single person in the room could answer him. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying the row of executives, the way a man studies a machine that has stopped working and needs to be understood before it can be trusted again. Micah explained quietly that the small component kept the entire production line running, that without it every downstream process on the factory floor would grind to a halt regardless of how much other inventory sat waiting in a warehouse somewhere. Colton observed, with unmistakable finality, that this was precisely the difference between people who understood prices and people who understood value. Genevieve felt the room shift against her with every question asked, each unanswered silence, another small crack spreading through the foundation she had spent the last 2 days trying to defend. She glanced at Everett, searching his face for the confidence he had carried into every meeting before this one, and found only a tight, brittle composure barely holding together. The executives beside him shifted in their seats, no longer certain whether solidarity with Everett was worth the price it had already begun to cost them personally. Genevieve attempted to win the clients back with discounted fees and extended service terms at no additional cost. Marlowe told her plainly that the issue had never been about money in the first place. No client could responsibly entrust their survival plans to a company that treated their own history and context as disposable clutter. Everett accused Micah of deliberately cultivating personal loyalty in order to undermine the company from within. Preston pushed back immediately, pointing out that Micah had never once asked any of them for loyalty to himself personally. He had only ever remained loyal to the promises the company made, even long after its leadership stopped honoring those same promises. Delaney then walked the room through several contractual protections Micah had quietly insisted upon years earlier: the right for clients to leave if operational methods changed significantly, full and permanent ownership of their own data, and the right to appoint an independent advisor if trust in their assigned team ever collapsed. Genevieve realized, with a sinking clarity, that these very protections had once made it legally easier for clients to walk away from her company, yet that same fairness was exactly why so many of them had chosen to stay loyal for so many years in the first place. One by one, every representative in that room announced their decision, and not a single one chose the committee of 33 executives. All 18 clients chose Micah to lead their transition toward an entirely new, independent arrangement, not merely because of his skill, but because he was the only person in the building willing to give them the freedom to leave if he ever failed them. After the room finally emptied, Genevieve turned to Everett and demanded that he release every scrap of data used to convince her to remove Micah from his position in the first place. Harrison pulled the original reports Everett had presented to the board and discovered exactly how much critical information had been quietly excluded. 17 of the 18 clients had specifically named Micah by name during their most recent renewal surveys, and the accounts under his direct care carried the lowest complaint rates of any division in the entire company. His unpaid consulting hours had almost always gone toward correcting mistakes the company itself had originally caused, and he consistently declined to upsell unnecessary services precisely because he refused to sell clients things they did not actually need. Everett had systematically transformed genuine client loyalty into supposed evidence of manipulation, twisting Micah's integrity into the very weapon used to remove him. Several of the 33 executives quietly admitted they had signed Everett's petition without ever reading the underlying data in full. Others confessed they had signed simply out of fear that opposing Everett openly might damage their own careers within the firm. Genevieve finally understood that 33 signatures had never truly represented 33 independent judgments at all. They represented a single opinion, repeated dutifully by 33 frightened people. Everett defended himself by insisting he had only done what he believed necessary for the company's long-term growth, and Micah answered quietly that growth built on stripping away a client's freedom to choose was not growth at all, only a slower, more expensive form of collapse. Genevieve suspended Everett pending a full independent investigation, but she refused to position herself as merely another victim of his manipulation. Alone in her office that evening, Genevieve sat with the lights dimmed, replaying every moment of the past few days, searching for the exact instant she had chosen comfort over honesty. She thought of her father, who had built the company on handshake promises rather than software, and wondered whether he would have recognized the firm she had tried to remake in his absence. The realization settled over her slowly, without drama, the way true failures often do, quiet, undeniable, and entirely her own to carry. She admitted openly, without excuses, that she herself had chosen to accept a convenient narrative rather than asking clients directly why they trusted Micah in the first place. August Whitmore pressed her to resign in order to protect the family name from further embarrassment, but Genevieve refused to run from the consequences of her own decisions. She announced instead that she would stay to personally oversee the company's restructuring, compensate affected clients fairly, and protect the many employees who had played no part in the failures that had unfolded. She offered Micah the company's highest executive position if he agreed to help retain the clients now leaving, and Micah declined the offer without hesitation. Returning simply to become the 34th title on an already broken wall, he told her, would never solve the underlying problem that had caused all of this in the first place. He agreed instead to sign a 3-month transition agreement intended solely to protect ordinary employees and ensure the departing clients could leave in an orderly, responsible manner. He asked only that Genevieve refrain from blocking any staff member who chose to follow him toward the new venture he intended to build. Genevieve agreed, fully aware that the decision would cost her company the vast majority of its remaining revenue. Micah left the boardroom that day carrying 18 signed letters of commitment from every strategic client the company had once depended upon, yet still without an office, a staff, or even a name for whatever came next. The weight of that moment did not feel like triumph so much as quiet, uncertain responsibility, the kind that comes only when people place their trust in someone and expect nothing less than for him to carry it well. The 3 months that followed the boardroom reckoning were quiet in a way that surprised almost everyone who had lived through the chaos of that single, terrible night. Genevieve kept her word, refusing to interfere as employees quietly submitted their resignations, one after another, many of them people Micah had worked beside for years without ever once asking for their loyalty. Delaney was among the first to leave, and Harrison followed not long after, drawn less by promises of higher pay than by the simple appeal of building something that finally made sense to him. Micah spent those months in unglamorous ways, signing leases, filling out insurance paperwork, and learning, often clumsily, how to run a business rather than merely rescue one. 3 months later, Micah opened the doors of Row Continuity Partners in a modest office space, with none of the marble floors or towering glass conference rooms that had once defined his former employer. All 18 strategic clients formally transferred their contracts to the new firm once their remaining obligations to Whitmore Crown had been properly fulfilled. Micah refused to manage every account personally the way he once had out of necessity, choosing instead to hire operations staff who had long been overlooked and giving them direct, meaningful contact with clients of their own. Each client had one clearly designated point of contact, yet the collective knowledge behind every account was shared openly across the entire small team, ensuring the company would never again depend so completely on a single individual. Crown One itself was not discarded or forgotten in the transition that followed. With Genevieve's approval, Harrison transferred an independent version of the platform to Micah's new company, and Micah reshaped it into a tool meant to support human judgment rather than replace it entirely. Genevieve restructured what remained of Whitmore Crown into a smaller, more transparent operation, losing significant revenue and influence in the process but preserving thousands of jobs through a cooperative transition alongside Micah's new firm. The two of them never became close friends in any conventional sense, but they built something quieter and arguably more durable, a genuine professional respect earned through hardship rather than convenience. During one of the very first client gatherings hosted by the new company, Preston asked Micah how it felt knowing that every single client had ultimately chosen him over an entire boardroom of executives. Micah answered that they had not truly chosen a person at all in the end. They had chosen the simple right to be told the truth, to be heard honestly, and to walk away freely whenever a promise stopped being kept. He left the office at a reasonable hour that evening, just as he always insisted on doing, choosing dinner with Lena over any celebration or recognition waiting back at work. They ate at the same small kitchen table where he had once helped her with fractions. The window above the sink fogged faintly with the warmth of the stove, and for a while neither of them spoke of Whitmore Crown or Crown One or any of the 33 names that had once decided his fate. Lena asked him, almost offhandedly, whether he was proud of what he had built, and Micah considered the question longer than she expected before answering that pride felt like the wrong word for it. What he felt, he told her, was closer to relief, the quiet relief of a man who had kept every promise he was capable of keeping, even on the nights when keeping them cost him almost everything. There were no framed awards or triumphant photographs hanging anywhere on the walls of his new office. Instead, a single handwritten line greeted every employee who walked through the door each morning, a quiet reminder he asked every member of his team to carry with them. "Clients do not belong to any company," the words read. "Their trust is only ever borrowed, and every single day must be spent proving we deserve to keep it." Genevieve had once believed that the combined weight of 33 impressive titles would always outweigh the presence of one single father working quietly in a windowless room down the hall. She had learned, in the hardest way a leader can learn anything, that titles could organize a company but could never earn its clients, and that authority handed down from above meant little compared to trust built patiently from the ground up, one kept promise at a time. But when every promise the company had ever made was finally placed on the scale and measured honestly, all 18 clients chose the one person among them who had never once treated their trust as something he was simply owed.
Won't burn the temple down. You posed a challenge, yet know not how to bear your retreat.
Shit.
You have ruined everything. That's all you're capable of. Show your hand.
Oh. Couldn't freeze him. Damn.
Rob and kill. Such are the deeds of you monkeys. But you still think you are better than us.
Damn. Oh my god, he got me. I want this in Spider-Man 2. Holy shit, my food's about to be here. Hi Phoenix, how are you doing today? Let's get it.